Hey everyone, welcome to Toast and Topics.
Today, we have another fantastic guest on the show, Douglas Irwin, a renowned trade economist and the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth. Professor Irwin is the author of numerous classics on trade economics, including Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy, and Against the Tide, An Intellectual History of Free Trade, which was voted as one of the best books of the year by both The Economist and Foreign Affairs. Professor Irwin is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
To add on to this already impressive list, in the earlier part of his career, Professor Irwin worked on trade policy issues as part of the staff of President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, and later worked in the International Finance Division at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve. And today we have the pleasure of having him on Toast and Topics. Just one more thing to throw on that resume.
So, Sachin and I both got to know Professor Irwin through his macroeconomic policy in Argentina and Chile course, Econ 70 for short, which Sachin took in 2019 and I took in 2021. This class was really unlike any other at Dartmouth. It involved spending a semester learning about the economies of Argentina and Chile in the classroom before actually traveling to South America to study them in person over the winter break. And so Professor Irwin has just gotten back from the 2023 iteration of this class, which visited both Argentina and Chile. And Argentina especially has experienced a huge amount of change over the past 3 months. And I think that there are a few people better positioned to talk about that change than Professor Irwin. So without further ado, Professor Irwin, thank you for joining us on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
So let's get started by talking more about the course itself. Tell us more about how you structured it this year, the guiding philosophy behind it, and why you think it's so valuable for students.
Well, the most important thing to note about the class is that I co-teach it with my wife and fellow economist here at Dartmouth, Marjorie Rose, and I wouldn't have done it and wouldn't be doing it without her. So it really is a team effort, and we try to put together a memorable class for students. And the idea is that, as you know, at Dartmouth, there are many foreign study programs, language abroad programs, and things of that, where you can go abroad for a whole quarter. But economics doesn't really have that. And that one reason is because it's very difficult to get econ faculty to uproot for an entire quarter and go to some other country. And we just don't have really a foreign study program in the economics department. We have exchange programs, of course, but not something that's faculty led. So the compromise is that we could teach a course at Dartmouth and then go for a 2-week excursion, sort of a in-country experience, studying countries that we had studied over the previous quarter. And when Professor Rose and I were thinking about doing this, we thought, well, it's important to be in the Southern Hemisphere in December, because this course can only be taught in the fall quarter when there's that winter and period that's available for students. So we want to go someplace warm. So that means south of the equator. And also, going to one country would be useful, but if we could go to two, you could actually see the contrast between them. And there's a huge contrast in terms of economic policies between Chile and Argentina. They're right next door to each other. They have similar endowments and things of that sort, but they've chosen different paths in terms of policy. So getting that contrast, not just with the US, but between two emerging markets, we thought would be a very useful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were some of the activities that you planned there as a class, and what was your personal favorite experience throughout your 2 weeks in the region?
Well, I guess what was special about the class we just taught, and it's different from the ones that you had taken, is our intention from the very start was to visit both countries. And both in 2019 and then 2021, we had problems doing that. So in 2019, there was social unrest in Chile. So we had to just spend 2 weeks in Argentina. And then 2021, the pandemic was easing off, but Chile was open and Argentina was not. So this is only the second time in the 4 times we've taught this course where we've been able to manage to visit both countries in the same trip. So that was a big highlight, just being able to do the contrast with the students. And I guess the Chile part was very much similar to what had been you've seen. The Argentina part was very much what you saw, Sachin. And the big difference was how we got from one country to the other. So In the first year, we just flew from Santiago to Buenos Aires. This time, we rented a bus and went up over the Andes from Santiago to Mendoza, and saw, the beautiful mountain ranges, a lot of snow, and just some spectacular vistas as we made that trip.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. And, one of my favorite components of being down in Chile with you and Professor Rose was that we were able to talk with so many interesting people on the ground. Just as an example, I got to speak with Chilean leaders at the World Labor Organization, and also officials in Chile's labor ministry. And so, could you tell us about how this process of engaging with policymakers and thought leaders from these countries affects the course?
It's really a key part and a really fun part of the course. So Professor Rose and I, through our contacts, we arrange for meetings with the whole group, and we've repeated some of those this time that you had seen before. But then the students also have to reach out in terms of their group projects and talk to policymakers, civil society leaders, academics, and others. And that works out a little bit more randomly, but they are also able, remarkably, as in your years, to achieve really high level access to people in various aspects of government and the private sector in both countries. And I think partly that's because of Dartmouth, partly because it's very unusual to have a group of American students come down to that region and want to speak about issues that really affect the country. So they tend to be, they tend to get positive responses. I know this year someone met with the Minister of Education, I believe, in Argentina,
Wow.
and similar level meetings in Chile, also with Startup Chile and some of the private equity groups. So once again, just very impressive what the students were able to do in terms of meeting new and interesting people.
Yeah, for sure. And because of all the independence you give students, I feel like this class is equally challenging to succeed in and can be overwhelming when actually on the ground there. So what do you think are the most important attributes for students to make the most of this kind of experience?
I think what hopefully you learned, and certainly this year's class learned, is that you have to send out 10 emails, maybe you get 2 positive responses, but once you have those meetings, you always ask those people, who else should we speak to? So you may start the trip with not many meetings scheduled, but it sort of cascades once you're down there as connections are made. And so that's sort of a fun part of it. It's something you can't really plan. That's why we try not to pack the schedule too much, because meetings sort of spontaneously come about. I think it's just a great learning experience about how you have to learn to knock on doors and take opportunities when they present themselves.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about what's going on in Argentina itself. The economic history of Argentina is fascinating, and the current developments there are equally so. Argentina was once one of the richest countries in the world. In the early 20th century, it had a GDP per capita that even surpassed that of many Western European nations, but things have since taken a turn for the worse in the country. Argentina is now best known for defaulting on its debts and having very high levels of inflation. Often people trace Argentina's fall to the rise of the Peronist movement in the 1950s, and I was wondering if you could tell us about this movement, the kinds of economic policies they promoted, and more generally, where you think Argentina may have taken a wrong turn in its economic policy making.
I'll sort of divide that into 2 parts. First of all, what is Peronism? And then second of all, pardon me, where Argentina took the wrong turn. It's
Yeah.
actually very difficult to define Peronism. When we always ask this, and we try to get speakers in Argentina to help us out. And they say it's not really a left versus political right sort of ideology. It's more sort of pro-labor, pro-industry in cities, anti-agriculture, anti-landowners. So there's sort of this urban-rural divide, if you will. And it tends to be a populist movement, very pro-labor. So they want to pass a lot of legislation that will protect worker rights, ensure that there are going to be high wages and unionization, protect industries from foreign competition. It tends to be nationalist, some would say even fascist in its approach and outlook. So it's sort of this hard to define, but those are some of the elements to it. And the reason why economists are sort of worried about the direction that Argentina has taken under Peronism is that it does tend to promote zero-sum thinking, that the reason why you are poor, Peronists would say, is that other people are rich. And so redistribution has to be undertaken. You don't worry about growth or expanding the economy. It's more winners versus losers, and sticking it to the groups in society that they would say have caused why you don't have a high enough income. So traditionally, as you know, Argentina exports a lot of agricultural produce and products, and so there's this sort of, you want to stick it to the landowners and the exporters, and tax them, offer them inferior exchange rates, because that way you can transfer wealth to other segments of society. Now, there's a debate, of course, about whether Peronism or other factors are responsible for Argentina's relative decline over the 20th century. And you might recall there's an interesting paper that sort of tries to go through the various tipping points, if you will, when Argentina really began to diverge from other countries. And it's not clear that Peronism in the late 1940s really led to this sharp break in Argentina's growth path. It probably didn't help things, probably slowed things down, but certainly the military dictatorship in the 1970s, there's a sharp break in terms of the pre-trend movement of Argentina's GDP and what happened in the 1970s. So the military dictatorship was disastrous. Then you had some reforms in the 1990s when Argentina began to do better, but then they sort of fell back after that period in the 2000s with the Kirchners, who were very Peronist in their policies, came into power. So it's sort of really been quite volatile and sort of different paths to economic policy over the years that just have not done well for the population in terms of sustaining growth and maintaining high levels of standard of living.
That makes sense. And how does this compare to other countries in Latin America?
Well, a lot of other countries in Latin America, pardon me, have also sort of gone down the path of populism. In fact, there's a paper coming out in the American Economic Review looking at the economic impact of populist governments, and it turns out to be pretty negative across the board on various indicators. And that's once again because there's a lot of inequality. So there's a lot of sense that we need to redistribute away from those who in society are doing very well and redistribute to labor and other groups. And that means shutting down trade to some extent, enacting very generous welfare benefits. So that requires high tax rates, and then you don't get as much savings and investment. A lot of Latin American countries have sort of pursued that path to various degrees. But the reason why we, of course, do Chile is Chile diverged from that in the 1970s when there was a military coup in 1973. Augusto Pinochet took over as the military leader in a very brutal dictatorship, but they changed economic policies in a way that was much more pro-market, pro being open and part of the global economy. And through some fits and starts, eventually in the 1990s, these policies really began to pay off. And Chile has just grown very rapidly since then, although it's slowed down over the past decade or so.
Yeah, understood. That's a very helpful overview. So one of the things that has certainly contributed to Argentina's longstanding economic problems has been borrowing. And in many cases, Argentina's borrowing is not denominated in its own currency, but is instead denominated in currencies like the dollar. And so just to illustrate this, Argentina owes the IMF around $43 billion currently. My question here is twofold. Number one, why has Argentina had to borrow so much over the years? And number two, how is Argentina able to afford to pay these external creditors back, if at all?
Well, that's a great set of questions, and it's a very important element to some of the problems that Argentina's run into over the past few decades, or many decades going back. I saw some amazing statistic about the fact that, and I won't remember this exactly correctly, but something over the past 50 years, almost every year they've had a fiscal deficit, except for 2 of those years. So they've had chronic excessive spending in terms of what they can raise in terms of revenue domestically. And it's partly an overspending issue. It's partly an undertaxation issue or a tax evasion issue. And it's partly a political economy issue where the provinces have the right to spend money that the federal government is then obligated to reimburse them for. So the fiscal authority in terms of the central government isn't exactly in control of fiscal policy if the provinces can spend whatever they want. So that result has been is that there's been too much spending, not enough money raised in taxes, chronic fiscal deficits, and if you can't finance those deficits through external borrowing, and you can't finance them through increasing domestic taxes and tax revenue collection, the way you finance it is through money printing, and that's basically what they've done in the past decade or so. Is just an increasing rate have to finance their fiscal deficit with printing money, which means higher inflation. And now it's just astounding from the time that you had studied it, inflation has really picked up. It's about 150%. The peso has depreciated, lost something like 90% of its value over the past decade. And so that's really the problem of the moment. Compounding that is that they have borrowed both from private creditors and the IMF in the recent past to sort of make the books balance out, and those debts become due. And they've defaulted a number of times to private creditors. They now have a big issue of a debt overhang that they owe the IMF. And so they've got a huge fiscal problem in terms of now cutting the fiscal deficit to get rid of inflation, but then also having the resources to pay their external creditors. And so they're really in a tough situation.
Yeah. So what does this all mean also for Argentina's local population in terms of, affording basic goods and services as well as their living standards?
Well, I think, as you might recall from being there, and Ben, from having studied the country, everyone in Argentina is aware of the inflation rate. They're aware that the pesos that they have are depreciating in value very quickly. And so if you get pesos, you want to do one of two things. You either want to spend them immediately, or in buying durable goods or going out to restaurants or something like that. You just don't want to hold them and see them depreciate at 10% a month, or you want to transfer them into dollars immediately. And so everyone, every day checks the exchange rate on their smartphone. And when they get pesos, they immediately try to convert them in one way or the other. So there's something known as the blue market rate, which is the unofficial sort of black market for dollars. It's a very different exchange rate than the official one that the government offers. And there's a lot of spending. So people are out on the streets and going to restaurants and buying durable goods to the best of their ability. So there's chronic complaints that wages are not keeping up with inflation. So people find it hard to make ends meet. There's chronic stress over just what to do with your pesos and how to manage your finances. And of course, the wealthy, they move their pesos into dollars and move them offshore much more easily than the lower classes can. And so the burden of the inflation falls on the poor more than the rich. But no one likes the situation, which is why in the most recent election, they went for an outsider candidate, Javier Milei, who promises to, we can get into this, promised to sort of abolish the central bank and get rid of inflation and get rid of the fiscal deficit. And we'll see whether he's able to do that.
Yeah, you've anticipated my next question very well. You were in Argentina during a really important time in the country's history because while you were there, Javier Milei was preparing to take power and I think may have even assumed the Argentine presidency while you were in the country. And so just to give our listeners some context here, Javier Milei is a man who's known to visit campaign rallies wielding a chainsaw to show his commitment to tearing down Argentina's existing political system. He's quite a character, to say the least. The Economist has described him, for example, as being a, quote, sex guru, cosplayer economist. And, you're an expert in the economic portion of this triad. And so I was wondering if you could comment on what it was like seeing Milei's rise in Argentina up close.
Yeah, it was quite fascinating. And you're right. We were in class at Dartmouth when he was elected. I think the election was in November. And then but also seeing his rise over the course of the fall. There's a previous election before that, and then the final runoff. And then the day after we left, he was inaugurated and became president and began announcing policies the Monday after we had left.
Wow.
So he was very much an outsider. He didn't have a political base in any sense, but he is a very passionate speaker. If you watch him on the old Twitter X or see videos of him. He is an economist, I guess, by training, and he sort of came out of nowhere to oppose the sort of establishment candidate, who is the current finance minister or economy minister. And someone said it was an election between fear and despair. So despair would be if you're voting for the incumbent who's actually responsible for the current problems, and you're basically saying no changes, or at least no major changes were being offered by, I think his name is Sergio Massa. And so that wasn't a very attractive choice for many voters. And then this guy is considered a little bit wild and not really known, a little bit extreme and sort of unpredictable, but he's sort of offering a solution. And so, as we saw, the electorate voted for him with the chainsaws. And so there's going to be, and sort of announced this, there's going to be some deregulation, but more importantly, a big fiscal correction. That is a big cut in government spending that's going to be opposed by a lot of people. And so we expect there to be protests on the streets as he cuts back spending at various ministries and lays off government employees and cuts maybe even welfare benefits. But it's sort of one that's necessary when you're running a fiscal deficit that's more than 5% of GDP and you're financing it with 150% inflation. So directionally, he's right. And the question is whether he can succeed in bringing about the changes to bring about a better day for Argentina.
Yeah, and let's get into more of Milei's proposals to remake the Argentine economy. So, right after assuming office, he quickly implemented what we refer to as economic shock therapy, and proposed dramatic cuts to fiscal spending, as you had kind of alluded to. This included, devaluing the peso, cutting electric and transport subsidies, and a proposal to halve the number of government ministries. And he's also coupled that with an increase in taxes and tariffs. And so he also has so little faith, I think, in Argentina's central bank that he actually had proposed completely dollarizing the economy, similar to some other countries like Ecuador and El Salvador. So, one thing I was curious about is, what do you think about the viability of this dollarization proposal? How does it even work? And what are some of the, upside and downside risks for the country as they work towards it?
Yeah, so dollarization is something he proposed during the campaign, along with what you said, getting rid of the central bank. And I think that was sort of an extreme way of dramatizing his commitment, in some sense, to getting rid of inflation and showing the electorate he was serious. And he's, as president, he's backed away from that. So you don't hear as much about dollarization. You don't hear about abolishing the central bank. You hear more about the fiscal reforms. So you're not asking the central bank to buy the bonds of the government directly. So he's become much more reasonable in that sense. But the dollarization would be an extreme measure where you just say, look, we have this big fiscal mess. We can't get out of it. And so we're just going to, have people pay their taxes in dollars. Dollars will circulate in the economy. We'll get rid of the peso altogether. And that really enforces a hard budget constraint on the government, because it can't print dollars. So it can only spend as many dollars as it brings in terms of tax revenue. So that the budget constraint really binds. It would succeed in getting rid of inflation, because as you mentioned, El Salvador, Panama, and Ecuador have dollarized. They have much lower rates of inflation, a lot akin to what we have in the U.S., because it's sort of a dollar-based standard. But the big problem, and many Argentine economists sort of opposed the plan, even those who thought that big reforms were needed. The opposition came from the fact that to dollarize, you need to have everyone exchange their pesos for dollars, and they do that through the central bank. And the central bank literally does not have the dollars with which to make that transaction or make that conversion. In fact, the central bank is a net debtor, has no dollar reserves on net after you subtract what it owes foreign creditors. So, even if you want to do it, it's almost infeasible, just on a practical level. But I think he sort of backed away from that. So even if it was feasible, it's not clear that he would do it. But it's sort of off the table for the moment anyway.
That's helpful. So to take a step back here and to think about the reforms that Milei is trying to accomplish generally, I think that he's going to face one really crucial difficulty, which is that in order to cut back a lot of the fiscal spending and largesse that Argentina has had over the past few decades, he is going to inflict some serious short-term pain on many Argentines who are benefiting from the subsidies that the government is currently giving out. And so no matter how viable and, you know, logically sound some of these policies are, they're going to involve costs that people might not be willing to put up with in the short run. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how exactly Milei might be able to manage that tension and whether you're optimistic that Argentina is going to be able to see these reforms through.
Well, you're right. It certainly is going to be a huge challenge. The alternative to doing sort of a shock therapy would be to do things sort of gradually reduce government spending, gradually increase taxes over 5 years or so there's not this immediate pain. But the problem is that was tried under a previous administration of Mauricio Macri, a non-Peronist who was in power in the late 2010s, and that failed. So the problems are just much more acute now than even under the Macri administration. And so that's why a lot of people think, they really have to do something big and dramatic in terms of scaling back fiscal spending to achieve any progress. So I think that and fortunately, Milei and his advisors have been very honest with the public, saying this is going to hurt. There's going to be pain in the short run, but we need to do this to get onto a better path. So they're not sugarcoating what is going to be happening. But you're absolutely right. There will be short-term pain, possibly a big recession, and a lot of people are going to be hurt, and there are going to be protests on the streets. One of the things we heard about is the concept of gnocchi, meaning the pasta that sometimes we eat, made from potatoes and flour and what have you. The term arises in the Argentine context because when people's budgets get short, towards the end of the month, when they're waiting for the next paycheck, people would often eat gnocchi at the end of the month because it's sort of a very cheap pasta. But it's also a term used to describe a lot of government employees who don't show up for work except for the last day of the month to collect their paycheck. So there's this view that the federal payroll is very much padded and in excess of what is needed. And as you mentioned, too, there are a lot of subsidies for fuel, for food, for all sorts of things that aren't targeted, that aren't helping the poor, that are helping the rich as well, such as keeping the price of fuel and electricity very, very low. So certainly there are things that can be done to get rid of those subsidies and get rid of those employees. It would save a lot of money, but at the same time, there's going to be protests when they try to do so. So this interface between, how long, can he get some legislation through the Congress? B, will the medicine begin to work fast enough so the protests dissipate? It's all very uncertain. I'd recommend one article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago by Moises Naim, who was a former economy minister of Venezuela. And he talks about the perils of reform, the difficulties of reform in a very lucid way.
Yeah, thank you for the recommendation. And just as a comment to add here, we studied Chile quite a bit in your class, of course, and that country was able to implement many of these reforms successfully, and it was able to deal with the short-term pain associated with doing so. But ultimately, Chile was not doing that within a democratic framework. And so if Argentina can pull this off now, within more of a democratic structure, that, would be inspiring and exciting. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. So Milei, I think, is also smart in trying to do a lot of stuff right up front, because you don't want to prolong the pain. You want to get it over with as soon as possible. And so you don't revert to the previous policies in the next election. So once again, that's the problem with one of his predecessors, Macri, is that he tried to do things gradually and didn't do things immediately. And then all the problems became on his watch. Whereas right now, Milei can blame his predecessors for the problems and saying, look, there's going to be pain, but it's necessary to do this because of what my predecessors did. It's not really me, and better times are around the corner. So we'll see whether that works out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I also heard that Macri has actually thrown some of his weight behind Milei recently. And it's, funny to see that he's basically endorsing this, significantly sharper reform path, at least relative to what he did when he was president.
Yeah, I think maybe there's some regret or some missed opportunities that he has, some bad feelings about. And so he's certainly not a fan of the Peronists, and so he's thrown his support behind what is apparently a radical guy, but once again he's moderated because he needs Macron's political support too. So he may be a shrewder political operative than a lot of people have given him credit for.
Hmm.
And in that vein, what do you see as being the biggest opportunities for Argentina over the near term and maybe over the next couple of years?
Well, as you might recall from being there, it's just a beautiful country. It has incredible resources, so much potential. They've just been squandered decade after decade. It really could be one of the jewels and the gems of all of the Americas, were it not for some bad economic policies that have been pursued for decade after decade. So if this medicine works, he turns the corner, the economy begins to grow, foreign investment comes in, and there becomes a political consensus that these are the types of policies that need to remain in place for Argentina to remain on this path, if they can get on a good path. I think the next half century could be wonderful for Argentina, and see a big improvement in standards of living, return to some political and economic stability. It's a narrow path that they have to run to achieve that. But once again, the potential of the country is just huge. And so I don't think there's anyone who's not rooting for Argentina to get its act together and really do well. It would be great for the people. It would be great for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about the world, even beyond Argentina, the global economy is going through a period of incredible change, with doctrines like free trade, for example, facing scrutiny, and national security rivalries at times getting in the way of economic connection. And so, just in that vein, given what's going on in the world broadly, do you have any books that you would recommend to help to understand what is going on and what is important right now?
That's a challenging question because events have changed so much in the past 5 years with the pandemic, coming off the pandemic and the big fiscal spending, and then the rise of geopolitics, as you mentioned, the rivalry with China, the Trump administration, the Biden administration continuing this and doubling down on industrial policy. Things are changing so rapidly. I'm not sure there are any books that really will be fresh on this topic. I look forward to your forthcoming book, of course, that will analyze the U.S.-China relationship a bit. There's one called
Thank you.
Chip Wars by Chris Miller that talks about semiconductors as being an important feature. But I would say reading The Economist, reading Foreign Affairs at the moment, that's sort of the best way to sort of keep up with what's going on. And we'll have to look for some books coming out in coming years that will sort of give us more of a historical perspective on what's going on. But things are changing so rapidly. Of course, we're facing an election here in the U.S. too. So the Biden administration's approach to industrial policy may be changing if there's a new administration. There's just a lot of uncertainty out there.
Yeah, for sure. And my favorite question that I like to ask everyone in the field of economics that we interview, what's the biggest piece of advice that you would provide your students with to succeed in the field of economics, as well as for those who might be interested in pursuing a career in a field related to economics?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I can answer it in two ways. One is just keep up with current events, read The Economist and books that are interesting to you in terms of different regions or different policies. So sort of know what's going on. And I guess second is that, if you go to graduate school for training or you're keeping up with your economic studies, also keep your eye on history. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the past. That certainly is the case, I think, with Chile and Argentina. And think about cross-country comparisons too. So just don't focus on the U.S., but have a broader vision about how different regions and different countries are managing their economic affairs and how that's working out. I think that just gives you a different perspective on things and makes you much more broad-minded about what economics is all about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and insight here, Professor Irwin. It sounds like you had another incredible trip to South America, and Sachin and I certainly miss your classes a lot. If you ever need chaperones, the next time you travel down there, please do let us know first.
Absolutely, you'll be top of the list.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice. And if you didn't like what you heard, please share it with a friend or family member to see if they might feel differently. In any case, we'll be around. See you again next time.